As we've seen when discussing certain media properties, there are some that seem to naturally fit the mold for video games, like Batman and Star Wars. Another that's carried on in exactly the same manner is Spiderman. The first Spider-Man game goes back to the Atari 2600, and for the limitations of that system, it's actually a pretty good game. Notably, it went out of its way to try and capture one major aspect of Spider-Man: web slinging. Roughly 10 years later, Sega would grab the character as part of its effort to use popular Western media properties to prop up the Genesis, before it had many of its own characters like Sonic. This game, known on the Genesis as Spider-Man, and on the Sega CD as Spider-Man vs. the Kingpin, was in many ways the state-of-the-art for what a Spider-Man game could be in the 16-bit era. As that generation went on, though, the franchise was slowly ground down with repeated lower-effort sequels under the dubious care of Acclaim and LJN. Spider-Man would fade away for the rest of the 1990s, until a new company picked up the license, and that company would be Activision. At this time in the late 1990s, Activision was not the pioneering company that started the entire concept of third-party developers back in the 1980s, nor was it the publishing powerhouse it would become in the 2000s. Instead, the company was slowly recovering from misdirection and financial mismanagement earlier in the decade, and was focused on carefully selecting and publishing hits that would put the company back on a solid footing to regain its old name and fame. It would get one of these hits in late 1999 when it put out the landmark game Tony Hawk Pro Skater that ignited a whole subgenre. It would follow that hit the next year when it had that game's developer, Neversoft, come up with another hit for the aging PlayStation. That would be Spider-Man. This would be the first 3D Spider-Man game, and in fact, it used the Tony Hawk Pro Skater graphics engine. Like with Tony Hawk Pro Skater, the Spider-Man game would capture the essence of its subject in a way that made people sit up and take notice. It let players web-sling around a 3D environment, albeit one that kept them suspended up at the building tops and far away from the ground. It gave them fluid and still complex fighting mechanics, utilizing Spider-Man's various abilities. It incorporated an original story and a plethora of characters, both heroes and villains. It even had voiceovers from Stan Lee himself.
Uh-oh, Spidey. Scorpion's headed out for old
Plus, for the original PlayStation, it was a graphically impressive title. Being a big enough hit, this game would also get ports to the PC, Nintendo 64, and Dreamcast. But Neversoft themselves would be too busy getting right back to work on their next Tony Hawk Pro Skater title to take up all of those additional jobs. That's where another of Activision's new favorite children would come into the picture, a little studio called Treyarch. Treyarch had been established back in 1996, and had kicked around the industry doing a few sports games while focusing on their primary project, a hack-and-slash medieval adventure game for the PC called Die by the Sword. A game that was lauded for its meticulously designed character physics, but as a result had some difficult-to-overcome control schemes for handling that character. Despite disappointing sales, the studio wanted to take another crack at their dream Dungeons & Dragons style game, and re-upped their contract with their publisher and set to work on making a sequel, Die by the Sword 2. But their publisher, Interplay, was not interested in them standing up another game for the PC, but instead taking it over to the Dreamcast, which was the talk of the town in 1999, and promised easy PC conversions with its included Windows CE environment. However, after some machinations, the publishing rights were passed around, and Treyarch ended up working with Crave Entertainment instead to publish the game at least in North America, except they did not have the rights to the original intellectual property anymore, so the game would be renamed as Draconis, Cult of the Worm, and after some significant delays, it would ship in the summer of 2000. Despite being a spiritual sequel to its original game, this new game was actually a wholesale technical rewrite of all the work they had done. They threw out all their existing codebase and engine work and started over for the Dreamcast, and sought to push the console to its stated limits right out of the box. So, although they had to delay their work some 9 months past their original shipping date, and although the game was met with mediocre reception, they did end up with a brand new, state-of-the-art next-generation console engine to work with. And 3 of the 4 next-generation systems hadn't even shipped in the United States yet. This put Treyarch ahead of many other studios who were still banging out their first-gen projects for the PlayStation 2 and waiting for Xbox and GameCube development kits to even arrive. In fact, they weren't even done with the Dreamcast yet. They would be contracted to make a game based on the Mattel toy line Max Steel, which they would use this engine to do, giving it quite the graphical jump compared to many other cheap and quickly licensed games at the time. It also made it a Dreamcast exclusive. More importantly for their future though, they were also contracted by Activision to port the Tony Hawk Pro Skater games to the Dreamcast. At the same time the studio was working on Draconis Cult of the Worm, they were also quickly making an enhanced port of Tony Hawk Pro Skater for Sega's new system. They would simply be using Neversoft's original PlayStation code as the basis for this version though. They would follow this up by handling Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2 on the Dreamcast, again taking Neversoft's original work and bringing it over. After taking Neversoft's work with Tony Hawk and upgrading it to next-generation hardware, Treyarch got another assignment to polish up their other PlayStation hit, and was tasked with porting the Spiderman game to the Dreamcast as well, which they released in early 2001. This put them on the radar for Activision, since they now had the opportunity to make a new Spider-Man game in conjunction with the upcoming movie due out in 2002. With Neversoft seemingly sentenced to the permanent Tony Hawk Pro Skater mines, the task of iterating out a new Spider-Man game now fell to Treyarch. Starting work right after finishing up their Dreamcast titles, Treyarch was looking at an 18-month development cycle, and they quickly learned from their experience on Draconis that they should probably not start all over again. Fortunately, thanks to Draconis, they already had a powerful next-generation engine they could adopt and use for the Spider-Man game. And as Jamie Fristrom, lead programmer for the project, shared in the post-mortem write-up on the development of the game for Game Developer magazine, they had Spider-Man swinging around Manhattan on the PC in record time, and could then proceed to bring that work to the consoles. However, now rather than just working on the Dreamcast, Treyarch was going to need to work on all 3 of the next-generation systems that remained, all at once: the PS2, Xbox, and GameCube, since this would be a multi-platform game, as was the style at the time. Naturally, since the PS2 was the leading system of that time, it would also be the lead platform they focused on, and brought the GameCube and Xbox versions up to parity with it as they went along. But they made sure they had developed one single graphics library they could use between all 3 platforms, and thus Treyarch's own internal Next Generation Libraries, or NGL, was born, to give them a smooth-ish process for developing games across all 3 platforms at once, which they were fortunately able to get done on time and on plan, with the game arriving shortly before the movie did on all 3 consoles on the same day, April 16th, 2002. So let's see what they cooked up. Just to get it out of the way, we have an intro cutscene, but since this game was largely developed independently of the movie, it doesn't have movie clips, but instead pre-rendered scenes that are straight from the pit of Uncanny Valley. Apologies to Tobey Maguire. The menus give us some choices to play with this time. The sound options are hiding the ability to switch to Dolby Surround sound, which is going to be pretty nice for a fully 3D Spider-Man game. You can choose between 2 different control layouts and different camera control methods, also fairly important for a Spider-Man game. The Specials menu is where the fun stuff is, as you have a Cheats menu for punching in all those fun, game-breaking cheat codes to mess around with. You can also use a level select to jump to any level you've unlocked so far. The Secret Store is there, which has more add-ons to the game if you can get a sufficiently high score of points. Lastly, and most importantly, there's the training. You'll also be offered to start the training when you choose a new game, and it will be highly recommended to do, as this is not a pick-up-and-play game. To help the medicine go down, the training section, and in fact all of the tips that are given throughout the game alongside the question mark points, are narrated by the irreplaceable Bruce Campbell, who had a small cameo in the Spider-Man movie and was a very common collaborator with that movie's director, Sam Raimi. But the medicine I mentioned is that you really do need to pay attention to get the full use of all the moves you'll need to survive and play this game. You can figure out some basics like swinging, jumping, punching, kicking, and webbing enemies, but the more complex things, like zipping to certain points, dropping down from the ceiling, changing directions when slinging around, locking onto enemies, and more advanced moves in combat, are all pretty bespoke controls that you'll need to be told and memorized. This is the first time in a while I had to break out the manual to look up how to conduct a move, since I accidentally cut off the narration that told me how to do it, and I could not figure it out at all otherwise. In fact, the training modes offered are actually expansive, and there is a lot of them. I think this is the most training modes I've seen since probably NBA Courtside. And like with that game, I was not going to stick around for all of them since I was kind of itching to play the game itself. Now, I'd never played this Spider-Man game back in its original era, but I always wanted to. When my family got our very first DVD player back in 2002, we had approximately 2 movies: The Lord of the Rings, Fellowship of the Ring, and Spider-Man. And on that Spider-Man DVD was a little tips and tricks segment in the bonus features that just showed you how to play some of the first few levels. Just seeing this little preview, I took away the main thing this game was meant to achieve. It looked really good. It portrayed the movie, the scenes, and the characters pretty spotlessly for that time at least. It looked like it let you be Spider-Man, like no game before had, fighting groups of thugs, crawling through air vents, zipping onto walls, and exploring New York. Sitting down in the modern day to play the game, after it's been superseded by many further iterations, it's much, much harder to get into. I try not to bring modern game comparisons into these impressions segments, but in this case it is unavoidable, as my experience was heavily tampered with by having different experiences and expectations with Spider-Man video games. That said, the game starts out on the right foot, having you hop into action, webbing around building tops in New York, looking for the gang that killed Uncle Ben. However, do not expect to be able to go down to the ground. That will get you killed. Also, as many folks, both then and now, have pointed out, the mechanics of web slinging have you attaching to some mysterious invisible point in the sky, and as you sling continuously, you drift upwards in your movement, so you need to repeatedly drop downwards and then resume slinging forward to maintain a straight line of traversal. Once you drop down into battle with some thugs, it's fairly straightforward and intuitive. You hit B to punch, X to kick, and you can use Y to shoot webs to tangle enemies up. But be aware, this is something you can run out of much quicker than you expect, and you need to find pickup tokens to replenish your webs, so use them sparingly. After beating up enough thugs, you move on to the next level and get to do some more Spider-Man action, but indoors. Crawling up the ceiling, through air vents, trying to keep stealthy and reach your objective, or just coming down from the ceiling right onto enemies. Now, while the fighting controls do come off as a simple beat-em-up style, if you try and play the fight sequences this way, you're likely to get killed, as too many enemies will pile on you, and those with guns will quickly chip off your health from afar. True to Spider-Man, you really do need to be constantly moving, jumping, hitting the walls, clinging to the ceiling, and taking your shots in when you can get them, while not allowing enemies to dogpile on you or get a fix on your position to shoot. This actually made the first boss fight easier than the scores of thugs I went through to get to him. Being a 3D Spider-Man game, the camera needs to be working overtime, since you can sometimes move in almost 360 degrees of 3D freedom, as you climb along surfaces or jump through the air in freefall. For a game of its vintage, it certainly does fairly well for 2002, but its limits and rough edges are apparent. It can certainly get stuck on the environment from time to time, and it seems to have some trouble recognizing your position relative to the camera, as your movement direction can sometimes take a few moments to adjust to a quick turnaround, leaving you walk in the opposite direction to where you wanted to go because the camera hasn't caught up with where you turned towards. This was all fine and workable enough, with a few tries of repetitive attempts that will set you back to repeat sections you've already completed. But moving beyond the intro sequence, you break out into the full open city world again and are confronted by aerial enemies. I tried in vain, repeatedly, to take them on entirely in air combat, but eventually found better luck luring them down to a building top and hitting them up that way. only for my best attempt to complete this mission to get completely nerfed when the game either lost track of where one of the enemies was or didn't account for my defeating it, leaving me with one enemy on the count I couldn't destroy, and forcing me to fall to my death and restart the attempt, at which point I really just did not feel like giving this my 5th or 6th or 7th try in a row. Like I said, earlier in 2002, this would indeed be the best Spider-Man game yet made. It took everything that made the 3D PlayStation Spider-Man game great and brought it into the next generation, and brought it up quite well. This engine looks remarkably smooth, stable, and has some of the best texture work we've seen thus far, outside of Rogue Squadron. It does live up to representing the movie really well, at least in engine. The Uncanny Valley cutscenes are an acquired taste. If you grew up with this game, and the controls, the weight of the character, and the sequences of the levels are hard-coded into you, the way I can just float through a Crash Bandicoot level without thinking about it, then of course, this will still be the same nostalgic game you remember. For everyone else, myself included, this will be a game that you'd really need to take time to immerse yourself into quite a lot to get used to and get the hang of. You'd honestly need to transport yourself mentally back to 2002, and erase your knowledge and feeling for how games that came later worked. And that's a pretty tall order. Spider-Man is a good game, or at least it was a good game. Whether it's a good game for someone today is in the eye of the beholder, but it certainly deserves its reputation for living up to the movie pretty well and not cutting any corners. Treyarch did a great job putting together a solid movie-based game in 2002, and set the stage for even better things to come.